He cut the steel gate with a chainsaw at 6:12 in the morning. I watched from the ridge above while sparks bounced through the fog like fireflies. My neighbor stood there in a neon hunting jacket, screaming at my contractor while his teenage son dragged cedar logs across the only mountain trail leading to my cabin. Then he drove a bulldozer straight over the property marker. That was the moment he made the biggest mistake of his life. Because what he didn't know was that the trail he'd just destroyed sat inside a conservation easement tied to 340 acres of surrounding timberland. Land my grandfather quietly bought after the Korean War. Land I inherited 3 years earlier. Land that completely surrounded his luxury mountain house on every side except one county road. I didn't yell. Didn't threaten him. Didn't even climb off the ATV. I just took another photo for the court file while he kept shouting that he owned this mountain now. By sunset, the sheriff, a land survey crew, and 2 state environmental officers were driving up that same trail. And his wife was already crying in the driveway. Before we get into this mess, subscribe if you enjoy HOA revenge stories where arrogant people learn property law the hard way. Because this one ended with helicopters over the ridge, and a foreclosure sign nailed to his gate. I'm not the kind of man people usually notice. At 62, I look more like a retired park ranger than someone sitting on one of the largest private land parcels in the county. Most mornings I wake before sunrise, drink black coffee on the porch, and listen to wind move through lodgepole pine while elk drift across the lower meadow. That mountain belonged to my family long before expensive vacation homes started crawling up the ridge. My grandfather bought the first 40 acres in 1954 after coming home from Korea with hearing damage, nightmares, and a hatred for crowded places. Over 4 decades, he quietly purchased abandoned mining parcels, timber scraps, and bankrupt grazing land until the property connected into one continuous block of wilderness. 340 acres, creeks, timber, old logging roads, a trout pond, and one narrow access trail cutting through the mountain basin. Most people around town knew me as the quiet Army engineer who came back home after 27 years of service overseas. I'd spent my career building roads, repairing flood zones, and managing terrain projects in places where bad maps got people killed. So when newcomers moved onto the ridge and started acting like they owned the mountain, I noticed things immediately. Property lines crossed, trees illegally cleared, drainage redirected downhill. But I stayed polite. The problem was my neighbor, Travis Mercer, interpreted politeness as weakness. Travis was one of those loud, wealthy transplants who treated rural counties like private theme parks. He drove a lifted black truck with custom flags on the back, complained about ugly cabins, and talked about turning the ridge into an upscale recreation district. The first week we met, he laughed when I told him the access trail behind his house had existed since the 1960s. "You old-timers really hate progress," he said. What he didn't understand was simple. He hadn't moved into a neighborhood. He'd moved into the middle of my family's history. And over the next 8 months, that mountain turned into a war zone fought with chainsaws, county maps, lawyers, cameras, and one devastating piece of paperwork nobody saw coming. My grandfather came home from Korea in the winter of 1954 with a duffel bag, permanent ringing in his left ear, and eyes that never fully relaxed again. My mother used to say the war followed him home like a shadow. Loud noises made him flinch. Crowded rooms made him sweat. Even fireworks on the 4th of July sent him walking silently into the woods until the noise stopped. So he bought land nobody else wanted. Back then, these mountains were full of abandoned mining scraps, dead timber parcels, and rocky acreage too isolated for developers. Most people saw worthless ground. My grandfather saw silence. He bought the first 40 acres with money earned repairing diesel engines at a logging mill. Then another 10 acres beside a creek. Then 20 more from a bankrupt rancher who needed cash before winter. For 40 years, he kept adding pieces together like a puzzle nobody else understood. By the time I was born, the mountain had become its own hidden world. The cabin sat deep inside the trees near an old logging road overgrown with moss and blackberry vines. It wasn't much to look at. Hand-cut beams, tin roof, stone chimney that smoked whenever storms rolled down from the ridge. But to me, it felt bigger than any mansion. I still remember the smell of pine sap warming in summer sunlight while my grandfather sharpened tools outside the shed. Rusted logging equipment sat half-buried near the tree line like forgotten dinosaurs from another century. Every board in that cabin carried fingerprints, sweat, or scars from his hands. At night, storms echoed through the valley so hard the lantern flames trembled on the table. That lantern light became part of my childhood. No television. No phones. Just rain hammering the roof, while my grandfather quietly drank coffee and studied weather patterns through the window. Sometimes in winter, the creek water froze solid inside metal buckets before sunrise. He'd hand me an axe and make me break the ice before breakfast while teaching me how quickly mountains punished carelessness. He taught survival the same way other men taught baseball. How to read animal tracks in mud. How to identify dying timber before disease spread. How to listen to wind direction before storms. But the lesson he repeated most stayed with me longer than any of those. Whenever we repaired fences or cleared fallen trees from the trail, he'd stop, lean against the shovel and say, "Land remembers who protects it." Back then, I thought he was just talking about hard work. Years later, I realized he was talking about responsibility. By the time I turned 18, I understood two things about myself. First, I loved those mountains too much to ever completely leave them. Second, staying there forever would probably turn me into the same silent ghost my grandfather had become after the war. So I enlisted. Most people think Army engineering is about bridges and bulldozers. Some of it is. But a lot of the job comes down to understanding how land behaves under pressure. Water, mud, roads, fire breaks, slope stability. One bad terrain calculation can destroy an entire convoy route or flood a town downstream. I spent 27 years with the Army Corps working terrain projects across the country and overseas. Flood recovery in Mississippi, mountain access stabilization in Colorado, emergency road reconstruction after wildfires out west. Over time, I learned something developers and impatient people rarely understand. Land always wins eventually. You can ignore drainage patterns for a year or two, maybe 5. But mountains keep records better than governments do. Sooner or later, erosion, water pressure, or gravity comes collecting. That career also taught me the value of documentation. Every easement, every survey marker, every environmental report. Paperwork saves people when memories become convenient lies. A lot of rural access easements out here date back generations. Even if ownership changes hands 10 times, legal access routes often survive because counties rely on them for emergency ingress during fires, rescues, or utility maintenance. Some mountain trails aren't just private roads, they're unofficial lifelines. That mattered more than Travis Mercer ever realized. When my grandfather died, I came home for the funeral wearing dress blues and carrying more regret than luggage. I kept thinking I had more time. More summers. More mornings drinking coffee beside him on the porch. Instead, I stood beside a pine-covered cemetery, listening to wind move through trees he once planted by hand. My mother stayed on the property after that, but age catches up fast in mountain country. Her knees got worse every winter. The isolation became harder on her. So after retirement, I moved back permanently to take care of her. 3 years later, I buried her beside my grandfather. And just like that, the mountain became mine alone. Not as a prize, not as wealth, as responsibility. I first met Travis Mercer in early October, about 6 months after I buried my mother. The aspens had just started turning gold across the ridge, and the mountain mornings carried that sharp, cold smell that comes right before first snowfall. I was repairing a washed-out culvert near the lower trail when 3 black SUVs rolled past my gate throwing dust into the air like a convoy. That was the first sign things were changing. The old Halbrook property above the ridge had sat empty for nearly 12 years after a developer went bankrupt during the recession. Most locals assumed the half-finished foundation would eventually collapse back into the mountain. Instead, an out-of-state investment group bought the parcel and built what looked more like a luxury ski resort than a home. Steel beams, massive glass walls, concrete terraces hanging over the valley. At night, the place glowed through the trees like a hotel. Then came the noise. Generators humming past midnight. ATVs ripping across the ridge trails. Private fireworks exploding over the lake during fire season. One weekend, I counted 3 helicopters landing near the property in a single afternoon. Travis Mercer loved attention the same way some men love oxygen. Tall guy. Expensive boots too clean for mountain living. Teeth so white they almost looked artificial. He always spoke half a sentence too loudly, like every conversation was meant for an audience. The first time he introduced himself, he shook my hand while staring past me toward the timberline. "Beautiful land," he said. "Crazy how underdeveloped this whole area still is." Underdeveloped. That word told me everything I needed to know about him. To Travis, mountains weren't history. They weren't ecosystems. They weren't homes. They were unused numbers on a spreadsheet. Within months, he started hosting gatherings with real estate people, investors, and county officials. Expensive trucks lined the ridge roads every weekend, while drones buzzed overhead taking aerial footage of neighboring parcels, including mine. Locals started hearing rumors about luxury cabin developments, private hunting retreats, and exclusive mountain communities. Travis called it modernization. Most of us called it slow-motion invasion. The worst part was how fake-friendly he acted while doing it. He'd smile while insulting people to their faces. "These old families are sitting on gold mines," he told a group outside the general store one morning. "Half of them don't even know how valuable their land is." Then he laughed and added, "Backwoods holdouts." His wife, Claire, usually stood nearby looking embarrassed while pretending not to hear him. Quiet woman. Nervous eyes. The kind of person who spent more time apologizing for her husband than talking for herself. By spring, the Newer Ridge homeowners officially formed an HOA. Travis became president almost immediately. And one afternoon, while staring across my property from the trail overlook, he finally said the sentence that told me exactly where this was heading. Nobody needs 340 acres to themselves. The first real conflict didn't start with yelling. It started with tire tracks. A week after spring thaw, I rode my ATV up the northern trail to inspect winter runoff damage, and immediately noticed the path looked different. Wider. Cleaner. Fresh mud pressed deep into the ground where heavy equipment had passed recently. Then I saw the stumps. 3 old cedar trees lay cut beside the trail, their exposed cores still bright and wet from fresh chainsaw teeth. Torn bark littered the ground like strips of broken leather. The sharp smell of sawdust and fuel still hung in the cold mountain air. Those trees had stood there longer than I'd been alive. I shut off the engine and walked farther uphill. That's when I noticed the orange survey tape tied around branches roughly 40 yards inside my property line. Not near it. Inside it. Bright plastic markers fluttered quietly in the wind, while muddy boot prints crossed through brush my grandfather once protected from logging crews decades earlier. At first, I honestly thought it had to be some mistake. So I drove uphill toward Mercer's property trying to keep things civil. I found Travis standing beside a compact excavator, while 2 contractors unloaded gravel near the ridge trail. The moment he saw me looking at the survey tape, he smiled like we were discussing weather. "Oh, good," he said. "I was meaning to talk to you about that." I asked him why his crew was cutting trees on my land. He didn't even hesitate. "It's community access," he replied casually. "We're improving the trail so emergency vehicles can get through easier." Community access. That phrase hit me strangely because I knew exactly what trail he was talking about. My grandfather helped establish that route with the county back in the 60s after a wildfire trapped 2 families beyond the ridge. But emergency access didn't mean public ownership. I drove back down to the cabin, retrieved the original county survey maps from my filing cabinet, and returned an hour later. The paper smelled old and faintly of dust when I unfolded it across the hood of my truck. Property lines. Easement markings. Historical access notes. Everything clearly documented. Travis barely glanced at them before smirking. "Those maps are ancient," he said. "The county's updating everything now." Behind him, another chainsaw started whining somewhere deeper in the trees. And for the first time since he moved onto the mountain, I felt something cold settle into my stomach. The letters started arriving 2 weeks later. Clean white envelopes with the HOA logo stamped across the corner like some kind of official government agency. At first, I assumed they'd been mailed by mistake. Until I opened them. The first notice complained that my cabin roof created visual inconsistency with neighboring ridge properties. The second warned me about improper exterior equipment storage, because my grandfather's old tractor sat beside the woodshed under a tarp. By the third letter, they were accusing me of maintaining unsafe trail conditions on the mountain access road that crossed my own property. I wasn't even part of the HOA, never signed anything, never attended meetings, never agreed to their rules. But Travis clearly believed if he mailed enough paperwork, eventually fiction would start feeling real. That's how people like him operate. Not through direct confrontation at first. Through pressure, paper, exhaustion. I ignored the notices initially because I dealt with bureaucratic nonsense most of my adult life. Army engineering projects taught me that some people weaponize procedure when they don't actually have authority. Still, the harassment slowly spread into daily life. Neighbors who used to wave now avoided eye contact in town. A local hardware supplier casually mentioned hearing I was fighting county compliance issues. Someone even reported my firewood stacks as a wildfire hazard. Every complaint carried the same polished Hoa language, same tone, same fingerprints. And underneath all of it, I could feel Travis testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before I pushed back. Then one cold morning near the end of April, I drove up toward the mountain trail and found a steel barrier post cemented directly into the middle of the access road. Fresh concrete still wet around the base. Bright yellow "Private Community Access" signs bolted onto both sides. For a long moment, I just sat there listening to wind move through the pines. Then I noticed the security camera mounted in a nearby tree facing directly at the trail, and I realized this wasn't neighborhood politics anymore. This was territorial warfare. The steel post disappeared the next morning. I removed it myself before sunrise using a chain, my old tractor, and 40 years of accumulated patience. No yelling, no property damage, no dramatic confrontation. I simply wrapped the chain around the base, pulled until the concrete cracked apart, then dragged the entire thing off the trail and left it beside the county road like discarded trash. By noon, another obstruction appeared. This time it was stacked cedar logs laid sideways across the access path near the upper switchback. Fresh-cut timber, heavy enough that removing them took nearly 2 hours with a winch and pry bar. That became the rhythm of our lives. Every few days, Travis blocked the trail again. Concrete barriers, boulders, construction fencing, parked equipment. And every time, I quietly cleared it. The mountain started feeling less like home and more like occupied territory. Then the cameras appeared. One mounted near the creek crossing, another overlooking the ridge bend, a third hidden inside a fake birdhouse aimed directly at my lower gate. I noticed them because military engineering work teaches you to study terrain differently than most people. Angles, sightlines, patterns. Travis, on the other hand, wanted the cameras to be seen. The intimidation was the point. Soon after that, clips from those cameras started showing up online. Grainy edited videos posted in local Facebook groups showing me removing barriers from the trail while dramatic captions accused me of tampering with community property. Travis framed himself as some kind of neighborhood protector dealing with an aggressive old recluse. People who'd never stepped foot on the mountain suddenly had opinions. The comments got ugly fast. Boomers think they own nature. Typical anti-development lunatic. Probably violating easements anyway. Somebody even posted drone footage of my cabin with laughing emojis attached. That part got to me more than I expected. Not because strangers online mattered, but because the mountain had always been the one place in my life untouched by noise. Now even the silence felt contaminated. One afternoon, I caught Travis standing beside the trail while 2 HOA members inspected the newest barricade he'd installed. He leaned against his truck smiling while I studied the mess of logs and metal fencing blocking emergency access. "You're wasting your time fighting this," he said casually. I asked him if he understood the trail was legally protected. He laughed. Then he looked around at the new houses climbing across the ridge and said the sentence I still remember word for word. "This mountain's changing whether you like it or not." Behind him, another drone lifted into the air and started circling above my property line like a vulture. By early summer, the conflict stopped feeling personal and started feeling organized. That's the thing about HOAs. And people obsessed with control, they rarely attack head-on once lawyers and property records enter the picture. They attack reputation instead. Suddenly, stories about me started spreading through town that sounded nothing like the truth, but close enough to make people uncomfortable. According to the HOF Facebook page, I was an anti-development recluse, creating safety risks for the entire Ridge community. Travis painted me as some bitter old man refusing to cooperate with modernization, while secretly violating county land use regulations myself. The wording always sounded polished, calculated, like somebody rehearsed it beforehand. Then the anonymous complaints began. County inspectors drove out twice in 1 month after reports claimed my fuel storage violated fire code. A separate complaint accused me of illegally dumping waste near the creek. Another claimed unstable trail conditions on my property could block emergency response vehicles during wildfire season. That last accusation almost made me laugh considering Travis was the one repeatedly obstructing the trail. But bureaucracies don't care who starts problems. They only care whether paperwork exists. One afternoon I came back from town and found a fire department truck parked outside my gate. Someone had reported excessive brush accumulation and high wildfire hazard conditions around the cabin. The firefighters looked embarrassed the moment they stepped out. One of them quietly admitted they'd received 3 separate complaints about my property in 2 weeks. 3. Everyone anonymous. Then my insurance company called requesting a temporary access review because concerns had been raised about emergency vehicle entry routes to the cabin. That conversation chilled me more than the threats did. Because once insurance companies start questioning access, everything becomes vulnerable. Coverage, liability, property valuation. All because one entitled man wanted control of a mountain he barely understood. The isolation settled in slowly after that. At the diner in town, conversation stopped when I walked in. People who'd known my family for decades suddenly avoided eye contact near the hardware store. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked nervous. Nobody wanted involvement. I'd open the mailbox and find it packed with violation notices, OO warnings, county forms, or legal-looking envelopes designed to create exhaustion more than actual consequences. That was the strategy. Pressure the target until defending themselves becomes their entire life. One night, I sat alone on the porch listening to wind move through the pine trees, while a distant ATV echoed somewhere across the ridge. And for the first time since inheriting the land, I understood why my grandfather loved isolation so much. People can destroy peace faster than storms ever could. A lot of people misunderstand how mountain access laws actually work. They assume if a trail crosses private land, the owner can block it whenever they want. Sometimes that's true, but not always. Out in rural counties, especially older mountain regions, access rights can become legally protected through long-term historical use. They're called prescriptive easements. If a route has been openly used for decades by utility crews, emergency services, neighboring properties, or county maintenance courts often recognize that access even if ownership changes hands repeatedly. That's why old ranch roads, logging trails, and creek crossings survive on maps long after the original owners die. And emergency ingress laws matter even more. In wildfire-prone areas, counties sometimes designate specific trails as critical emergency access corridors. Fire crews, ambulances, and rescue teams rely on those routes during evacuations or medical emergencies. Blocking them creates serious liability because if someone gets trapped, delayed, or injured due to obstruction, responsibility can shift very quickly, especially if the obstruction was intentional. That's the part Travis never bothered learning. He treated the mountain like suburban real estate where fences and HOA signs magically override decades of legal history. But mountains operate under older rules: survey records, water flow rights, emergency access agreements, historic easements. Those things outlive personalities. And every time Travis blocked that trail with equipment or barriers, he wasn't just escalating a neighbor dispute. He was building evidence against himself. The problem was, he still believed intimidation mattered more than documentation. People like that usually learn too late that courts trust paper trails more than loud opinions. The first fence got cut sometime during the second week of July. I found it early in the morning while checking the lower pasture near the creek basin. 3 strands of barbed wire had been sliced clean through and folded back into the grass. ATV tracks crossed directly over the opening before disappearing uphill toward the ridge homes. Not vandalism for profit. Vandalism for intimidation. I repaired it myself before noon under 90-degree heat, while horseflies swarmed around my shoulders and sweat soaked through my shirt. The entire time, I could feel eyes on me from somewhere higher up the mountain. 2 days later, one of my trail cameras disappeared. Another was smashed against a cedar trunk hard enough to crack the housing open like an eggshell. Memory card gone. Battery ripped out. The third camera survived only because I'd hidden it deeper in the brush overlooking the creek crossing. When I checked the footage that night, I saw blurry movement just before midnight. Headlights. 2 figures. One carrying a shovel. Then static. No faces visible, but I already knew. The damage escalated after that. Someone dumped several truckloads of loose gravel directly into the Trout Creek running below the North Ridge. Fine gray sediment spread downstream through spawning pockets my grandfather spent years protecting from runoff damage. I stood knee-deep in the water staring at it, while tiny dead minnows floated against the current. That hit me harder than the fences. Creeks are living systems. Once sediment chokes them, recovery can take years if the damage spreads far enough. Then came the drainage ditch. Mercer's contractors redirected runoff, from one of the upper ridge construction pads straight downhill toward my timberline. During heavy rainstorms, muddy water started cutting fresh channels across the slope, carrying rock and debris into the lower access trail. Erosion doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks slow, quiet, but mountains unravel 1 inch at a time. The breaking point came 3 nights later after a thunderstorm rolled through just before dawn. I grabbed a flashlight and hiked toward the old cedar bridge spanning the narrow creek crossing near the upper trail, the same bridge my grandfather built by hand in 1972 after spring floods washed out the original crossing. Half of it had collapsed into the water. Fresh tool marks scarred the support beams. One anchoring bolt had been deliberately loosened. Rainwater finished the rest. I just stood there in the dark listening to creek water rush beneath broken boards while lantern memories from childhood flashed through my head. That bridge wasn't valuable, wasn't modern, wasn't even visible from the main ridge. But my grandfather built it himself using reclaimed logging timber and army surplus hardware because he believed if you cared for land properly, the land eventually cared for you back. Seeing it broken felt different from legal harassment, different from HOA letters. This felt personal, like someone was trying to erase fingerprints left behind by the people who came before me. And standing there in the rain beside that shattered bridge, I realized Travis Mercer wasn't fighting over property anymore. He was fighting over control of history itself. About a month into the property damage, Travis stopped relying solely on intimidation. That's when he started using the county. I first noticed it during a zoning office visit in town. I'd gone in to request updated floodplain maps for the Lower Creek Basin when I saw Travis standing near the front counter laughing with Dale Renner, one of the county zoning supervisors. Dale had worked land use enforcement for years. The kind of man who always looked tired, sunburned, and politically cautious. Before Travis arrived on the mountain, Dale barely cared about minor cabin properties unless somebody built something dangerous. Now suddenly he cared about everything. Within 2 weeks, I received notice of an environmental compliance review regarding potential watershed disturbances on my property. Then came a cabin safety inspection request. Then questions about historical timber harvesting permits connected to parcels my grandfather purchased decades earlier. Every letter sounded official enough to create stress without accusing me of anything specific. That's how selective enforcement works in rural counties. Most people don't realize local governments often overlook minor technical violations for years because enforcement resources are limited. Old sheds, legacy cabins, gravel roads, fence placements. Half the county technically violates something buried inside outdated land use codes. But once somebody influential starts making complaints, those dormant regulations suddenly become weapons. And the process itself becomes punishment. Even if inspectors find nothing serious, you still lose time, money, and peace of mind responding to endless paperwork. Travis understood that perfectly. At HOA meetings, he started publicly implying I was violating conservation protections while pretending he cared about environmental stewardship. The hypocrisy would have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous. This was the same man whose contractors dumped sediment into trout water and redirected runoff downhill without proper grading controls. But perception matters more than truth once enough people repeat the same story. One afternoon, I walked outside and found 2 county vehicles parked near my equipment shed, while an inspector photographed stacked lumber beside the barn. Above us, Travis's drone hovered lazily over the tree line recording everything. That was the moment I understood the real strategy. He wasn't trying to beat me legally yet. He was trying to exhaust me emotionally until I either sold the land or made a mistake angry enough to use against me later. A few days after the county inspections, I finally went looking through my grandfather's old records. Not because I was panicking, because something about Travis's confidence felt wrong. People bluff all the time in property disputes, but Mercer acted like somebody had assured him the mountain already belonged to him eventually. Like he was operating from information I hadn't seen yet. So one rainy afternoon, I unlocked the old storage room behind the cabin workshop, where decades of family paperwork sat stacked inside metal filing cabinets and weathered army surplus crates. The room smelled like dust, cedar, and old paper. I spent hours sorting through survey maps, timber receipts, handwritten boundary notes, and yellowed county correspondence dating back to the 1960s. My grandfather documented everything obsessively. Every fence repair, every trail adjustment, every seasonal creek shift. Military habits never fully leave certain men. Near the bottom of one cabinet, I found a thick binder stamped with faded Army Corps markings. Inside were terrain surveys, hydrology reports, and emergency access evaluations tied to the Ridge Basin after a wildfire scare back in 1978. That caught my attention immediately. Then I found something else. A conservation easement agreement connected to a state wildlife migration corridor running through the upper timberline near Mercer's property. I sat there quietly rereading the language, while rain tapped against the cabin roof overhead. Protected runoff zones. Emergency vehicle ingress routes. Restricted land disturbance areas. Some sections had been updated years later with county signatures attached. Suddenly, several things started making sense. The trail. The creek crossings. The oddly specific route boundaries my grandfather always protected so carefully. I didn't fully understand the implications yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Travis Mercer had spent months bullying the wrong piece of land. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt the balance beginning to shift. I woke up at 6:12 that morning to the sound of heavy machinery echoing through the valley. Not chainsaws. Not ATVs. A bulldozer. The kind of deep metallic grinding noise you feel in your chest before you fully hear it. I grabbed my jacket, drove uphill on the ATV, and smelled diesel smoke before I even reached the trail. The entire mountainside looked wounded. Fresh mudslides carved through the slope where the access path used to run. Cedar roots stuck out of the earth like broken bones. Part of the creek embankment had collapsed into the water after Mercer's crew pushed soil straight through the protected runoff zone. And my steel gate lay twisted sideways in the ditch. Travis stood near the bulldozer shouting directions at two contractors while dirt rolled downhill toward the creek basin. For a moment, I honestly couldn't speak. Not because I was angry. Because I finally understood how far he was willing to go. He turned when he saw me watching from the trail edge. Then he smiled, like he'd already won. I slowly pulled my phone from my pocket and stepped away from the noise while another section of muddy earth collapsed downhill behind him. The sheriff answered on the second ring. I gave my name, my property location, and requested immediate response assistance for active land destruction and easement obstruction. Then I looked back at the creek water turning brown beneath the bulldozer tracks and added one final sentence. You may want to send environmental enforcement too. The sheriff arrived first. Two county cruisers rolled slowly up the damaged trail just after 9 in the morning while fog still clung to the upper ridge. Behind them came a white survey truck pulling equipment trailers loaded with tripods, range poles, and GPS mapping gear. That's when Travis stopped smiling quite as much. Still, he acted confident. Arms crossed. Expensive sunglasses. Loud enough for everyone nearby to hear him explaining how he was finally fixing unsafe access conditions the county had supposedly ignored for years. By then, half the Ridge neighborhood had gathered along the roadside watching the scene unfold like some kind of outdoor courtroom. People always show up once power shifts start becoming visible. The survey crew worked quietly at first. No arguments. No speeches. Just professionals walking the land with old plats, digital mapping equipment, and county archives spread across the hood of a truck. I recognized the lead surveyor immediately, Hank Dobson, 70 years old, former forestry mapper, one of the few men left in the county who still understood historical mountain boundary records better than computers did. Hank barely acknowledged Travis. He simply studied the terrain for several minutes, then started locating original iron pins buried along the timberline. One by one, bright orange legal markers appeared across the ridge. And every new flag made Travis visibly more irritated. The first marker confirmed the access trail sat entirely inside my grandfather's original parcel boundary, except for the historic emergency easement corridor. The second marker showed Mercer's bulldozer tracks crossed directly through protected runoff land, tied to the conservation agreement I found in the records room. Then the third marker changed everything. Hank walked uphill toward Mercer's newly constructed retaining wall overlooking the valley and crouched beside a partially buried rebar pin hidden beneath fresh landscaping stone. He checked the coordinates twice, looked at the map again, then slowly stood up. By now, even the HOA members watching from the roadside had gone quiet. Hank removed his gloves, pointed toward the wall, and spoke calmly enough that everyone heard him. "Sir," he said. Then he glanced back at Travis. "Your retaining wall is also 6 feet over the line." The silence afterward felt enormous. I watched the color drain from Travis's face while his wife turned toward the wall like she was seeing it for the first time. Because suddenly this wasn't about trail disputes anymore. Now it was encroachment. Protected land violations. Unauthorized construction. And standing there beside those bright survey markers cutting across the mud, I realized the mountain had finally started answering back. The environmental officers arrived just before noon in two dark green state trucks coated with road dust and mud. Unlike county inspectors, these people didn't care about HOA politics. They cared about damage. The moment they stepped out and saw the bulldozed creek crossing, their entire tone changed. One officer walked straight toward the runoff basin without introducing himself. Another started photographing the exposed slope where loose sediment still bled downhill into the water. Meanwhile, Travis kept talking. That was his biggest mistake. He followed them around explaining how he was improving access infrastructure for the community, while casually blaming me for delaying development upgrades. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, corporate, hollow. The officers barely responded, because mountains leave physical evidence. And physical evidence doesn't care about personality. Within 30 minutes, they identified multiple violations. The bulldozer cuts had breached a protected runoff stabilization zone connected to the watershed below the ridge. Sediment from the disturbed slope had already entered trout habitat downstream. Several mature cedar root systems had been destroyed inside erosion control boundaries, specifically designed to prevent hillside collapse during wildfire season. Then one officer asked the question that changed the entire atmosphere. Who authorized disturbance inside the corridor? Travis frowned. What corridor? That's when I walked over, carrying the binder from my grandfather's records room. I laid the documents across the hood of the survey truck while wind pushed dust across the ruined trail behind us. Wildlife migration agreements, conservation easement records, state watershed protections, emergency wildfire access designations. All signed, all recorded, all enforceable. The upper ridge wasn't just private land. Part of it functioned as a protected wildlife movement corridor connecting state forest acreage to lower migration zones during winter seasons. The trail system also served as an emergency wildfire ingress route established decades earlier after the 1978 fire risk assessment. That meant unauthorized obstruction or terrain alteration carried far more liability than ordinary property disputes, especially once environmental damage occurred. A lot of people don't realize restoration liability can become catastrophic in mountain regions. When protected runoff systems are damaged, agencies can require full slope stabilization, sediment remediation, creek restoration, replanting, engineering reviews, and long-term environmental monitoring. And the person responsible usually pays for all of it. I watched Travis reread the documents while sweat slowly formed along his temples despite the cold mountain wind. For the first time since moving onto the ridge, he looked uncertain, not angry, not smug, afraid. Then the lead environmental officer closed the binder, stared directly at the bulldozer tracks cutting through the mud, and said the sentence that finally shattered whatever confidence Travis had left. This is no longer a civil disagreement. The county hearing happened 10 days later inside a crowded civic building that usually hosted fishing expos and winter craft fairs. That night, it felt more like a trial. Every folding chair was filled before the meeting even started. Homeowners from the ridge packed the back walls whispering over printed HOA notices, while reporters from 2 local papers stood near the entrance holding cameras. Even people who hated drama showed up. Because small towns treat public collapse like weather, everyone wants to witness the storm firsthand. Travis arrived with 3 HOA board members and a private attorney wearing a Navy suit that probably cost more than my truck. They carried thick binders and walked into the room projecting the same confidence they'd shown for months online, like this was still their stage. I sat quietly near the front beside Hank Dobson and a county records clerk while rain tapped softly against the building windows outside. Then the accusations started. The HOA attorney claimed I created unsafe access conditions on the ridge. Travis accused me of resisting emergency infrastructure improvements and obstructing community development initiatives. Another board member implied my property maintenance practices threatened environmental stability across neighboring parcels. Listening to them felt surreal considering half the environmental violations under investigation traced directly back to Mercer's bulldozer work. But arrogance makes people sloppy, especially when they mistake intimidation for evidence. When my turn finally came, I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue. I simply started laying documents onto the overhead projector one piece at a time. Original property deeds dating back to my grandfather's purchases in the 1950s. Historical aerial photographs clearly showing the trail system decades before the HOA even existed. Survey maps. Emergency ingress agreements. Conservation easement records. Then I played the footage. Security camera clips showing barriers repeatedly placed across protected access routes. Bulldozer tracks crossing marked runoff zones. HOA members discussing trail obstructions while standing beside illegal fencing. The room grew quieter with every minute. You could actually feel the shift happening. People who'd spent months believing Travis's version of events slowly started realizing they'd been manipulated by polished language and selective storytelling. Even some HOA residents looked stunned. Then the county attorney finally spoke. He adjusted his glasses, reviewed the final survey documents, and turned toward the HOA board with an expression that looked almost irritated. "The HOA," he said carefully, "has no jurisdiction whatsoever over Mr. Holloway's property." The room went dead silent. No whispers. No papers moving. Nothing. Across the aisle, Travis stared straight ahead while his wife lowered her eyes toward the floor. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, he looked like a man realizing the crowd around him was no longer on his side. I could have stopped there. Honestly, part of me wanted to. The county attorney had already dismantled the HOA's authority claims. Environmental enforcement was moving forward. Public opinion had shifted hard enough that even people who supported Travis months earlier now avoided standing too close to him inside the hearing room. But there was still one thing nobody else understood yet, including Travis. I waited until the room settled again before walking toward the overhead projector with one final survey packet in my hands. "Since we're discussing access rights," I said calmly, "there's probably something else the board should understand." Then I unfolded the perimeter maps. At first glance, they looked confusing. Multiple parcels. Timber boundaries. Utility corridors winding through the ridge basin like veins across the mountain. But once the county surveyor highlighted the ownership overlays, the room slowly began piecing it together. My grandfather hadn't just purchased random land over 40 years. He'd strategically connected nearly every major parcel surrounding the upper ridge, including the land around Mercer's property. The only direct county road touching Travis's home terminated at the lower switchback near my southern timberline. Beyond that point, every utility easement, maintenance turnout, drainage route, snow clearing access lane, and emergency vehicle bypass crossed property connected to my family holdings. Legally. Documented. Recorded for decades. Then came the final detail. The temporary shared access maintenance agreement benefiting Mercer's subdivision signed years earlier during the original development approval process was approaching renewal review within 11 months. And because of the environmental violations now under investigation, county approval would require updated landowner cooperation and compliance certifications. I watched realization spread across Travis's face piece by piece. First confusion. Then disbelief. Then genuine fear. Beside him, Claire slowly covered her mouth with one hand while staring at the maps projected across the wall. Because suddenly they understood the full picture. The mountain development they treated like a private kingdom only functioned because generations of prior landowners, including my grandfather, allowed cooperation instead of conflict. Utilities depended on shared easements. Winter access depended on coordinated maintenance. Wildfire evacuation depended on emergency turnouts crossing protected land. Even storm drainage systems connected downhill through parcels Travis spent months antagonizing. The room stayed completely silent while Mercer stared at the maps like they'd physically betrayed him. Then I looked directly at him for the first time that entire evening and spoke quietly enough that people leaned forward to hear it. "You spent 8 months trying to trap the wrong neighbor." Travis didn't answer. He just stood there motionless while the reality of the mountain finally closed around him. Everything collapsed after that. The court orders came down less than 3 weeks later. Full environmental restoration. Mandatory slope stabilization. Protected creek remediation. Removal of unauthorized trail obstructions and encroachments. The fines alone were staggering. State environmental penalties. County code violations. Civil liability tied to easement interference. Engineering oversight costs. Emergency mitigation requirements before winter runoff season. Every agency involved wanted payment. And the worst part for Travis? The HOA insurance carrier refused coverage almost immediately. Intentional land disturbance. Unauthorized obstruction activity. Recorded harassment evidence. Too much documentation. Too much exposure. The insurer basically concluded the board created the disaster themselves. By early fall, contractors started dismantling the illegal retaining wall overlooking the ridge. Excavators removed unauthorized fill dirt while erosion control crews installed drainage barriers across the damaged slope. For weeks, helicopters circled above the mountain carrying restoration materials into areas now considered too unstable for heavy ground access. Local news stations even aired aerial footage of the repairs. That was the final humiliation. Not private failure. Public failure. Public failure. Everyone in the county watched the same ridge Travis once bragged about transforming, now covered in orange safety fencing, environmental crews, and state enforcement vehicles. The HOA board quietly dissolved 2 months later. Then one cold morning near the start of winter, I drove past Mercer's property on the way into town and noticed a white document stapled directly beside the front gate, foreclosure proceedings. The paper fluttered in the mountain wind while snow drifted lightly across the driveway. And for the first time in nearly a year, the ridge was completely silent again. Travis Mercer didn't lose everything all at once. People imagine justice as some dramatic explosion where handcuffs appear and villains instantly collapse. Real consequences usually arrive slower than that. More administrative, more humiliating, and somehow more painful because everybody watches it happen in pieces. The bankruptcy rumors started first. Contractors filed unpaid invoices connected to the environmental restoration work. Attorneys involved in the easement disputes placed liens against portions of Mercer's development holdings. Then the state finalized long-term monitoring requirements tied to the damaged runoff zones, which meant ongoing engineering costs for years. Money started bleeding out of him from every direction. The HOA board unraveled right behind him. 2 members resigned quietly after residents demanded financial transparency regarding legal spending. Another tried blaming Travis entirely during a public meeting that nearly turned into a shouting match inside the community lodge. By winter, the HOA itself was effectively dead. No meetings. No enforcement letters. No smug online announcements about community modernization. Just silence. Then the county investigation expanded. Turns out people become very cooperative once legal exposure starts climbing. Emails surfaced showing unusual communication between Travis and zoning officials during the inspection campaign against my property. Questions emerged about selective enforcement practices, accelerated complaint reviews, and informal discussions surrounding development approvals near the Ridge Corridor. Nothing criminal was ever publicly announced. But suddenly several county employees retired much earlier than expected. Funny how that happens. As for Travis, the mountain finally stopped looking like an investment opportunity and started looking exactly like what it had become. A financial crater. His luxury house hit the market in February, listed nearly $400,000 below what he originally paid for it. The real estate photos tried hard to hide the environmental fencing still visible near portions of the upper ridge. Nobody local was interested. Most people in town had already heard enough stories to stay away. One evening near sunset, I drove past the property and noticed Claire alone in the driveway supervising movers loading boxes into a rental truck while snow drifted softly across the retaining wall that no longer legally belonged where it stood. I didn't feel victorious watching it. Just tired. Because by then the mountain looked wounded too, and some battles leave scars on everyone involved, even the people who win. The restoration work lasted almost an entire year. Mountains heal slower than people expect. You can rebuild fences in a day, replace a gate in an afternoon. But damaged land takes patience. Water needs time to settle back into natural patterns. Roots need seasons to hold soil together again. And trust takes even longer. By spring, the creek finally started running clear again. State crews stabilized the runoff slope first, installing erosion control barriers and reseeding damaged sections with native grasses. Then local conservation volunteers helped plant hundreds of young cedar and lodgepole pine saplings across the disturbed hillside. I spent most mornings walking the ridge with coffee in hand, watching tiny signs of recovery appear one by one. Birdsong returned first, then trout. By early summer, you could stand beside the creek and actually hear clean water moving over rock again instead of thick sediment dragging through the current. The old trail took longer. This time, it wasn't widened for luxury access or oversized trucks. The county restored it properly using the original emergency corridor plans from decades earlier, narrow enough to respect the terrain, strong enough for fire crews if disaster ever came again. Funny how the outdated maps suddenly mattered after all. The bridge reconstruction became something bigger than I expected. A veterans group from town volunteered to help after hearing about my grandfather's history. Local ranchers brought lumber. Retired carpenters showed up with tools before sunrise. Even a few younger families from the ridge joined in carrying supplies uphill. For the first time in over a year, People stood on that mountain working together instead of fighting over it. The smell of fresh cedar filled the air while hammers echoed through the trees exactly the way they did when I was a kid, helping my grandfather repair storm damage after hard winters. And one afternoon, while the final support beams were being secured into place, I looked down the restored trail and saw 3 neighborhood kids hiking toward the creek carrying fishing poles and laughing loud enough to scare birds from the timberline. That sound hit me harder than the courtroom victory ever did, because greed had nearly turned the mountain into territory. But healing slowly turned it back into community again. A few weeks after the bridge was finished, I found myself back in the storage room behind the workshop looking through my grandfather's journals again. Not for legal records this time, just memory. The mountain had finally gone quiet again, and silence has a strange way of pulling old ghosts closer. Dust floated through narrow beams of evening light while I flipped carefully through handwritten pages filled with weather notes, timber sketches, creek measurements, and little observations about wildlife migrations. My grandfather documented life the same way some people write prayers. Simple, precise, honest. One journal near the bottom of the crate looked more worn than the others. The leather corners were cracked from decades of use, and several pages smelled faintly of smoke from old cabin winters. I sat there reading until I found a line underlined twice in faded pencil. Some men mistake ownership for control. That was it. No long explanation. No dramatic speech. Just one sentence sitting alone on the page like he already understood exactly what kind of people would eventually come looking at those mountains. I carried the journal outside and sat on the porch as sunset settled across the ridge. The air smelled like pine needles warming under the last light of day. Far below the cabin, the restored creek reflected orange streaks from the sky, while wind rolled softly through the timberline. Beside the porch steps, the American flag my grandfather raised years ago moved slowly against the mountain breeze. And near the window, the old lantern glowed again for the first time in months. Same warm light. Same soft flicker against the cabin walls. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the mountain breathe around me. Not victorious. Not angry. Just grateful that some things had survived long enough to matter. People ask me sometimes if the fight was worth it. Honestly, I still don't know how to answer that. Because defending land isn't really about winning. Not the way people online imagine it. It's not about humiliating somebody or proving you're tougher than the next man. It's about stewardship. That mountain existed long before Travis Mercer arrived with development plans and HOA paperwork. It survived logging booms, wildfires, mining collapses, floods, and generations of people trying to bend it into whatever made them money fastest. And long after all of us are gone, those ridges will still be standing there under snow and pine wind. That perspective changes a person. The biggest thing this whole nightmare taught me is that HOA power or any kind of intimidation only works when decent people become too exhausted or too afraid to push back. Most bullies count on silence. They count on paperwork confusion. They count on people surrendering simply because fighting feels inconvenient. That's why records matter. Maps matter. Documentation matters. Patience matters. And knowing your rights matters most of all. If you own land, protect your history before somebody else rewrites it for you. Keep copies of everything. Learn your easements. Understand your county laws. Because once greed collides with property, truth alone usually isn't enough. You need proof. As for the mountain, it's peaceful again now. The trail's open. The creek runs clear. And some evenings, if the wind hits the trees just right, I still hear my grandfather's voice reminding me why any of this mattered in the first place. Some people think owning land gives them power over others. But the mountain was here before all of us, and it has a way of humbling arrogant men. Now I want to hear from you. What's the worst neighbor dispute you've ever seen? Would you fight back? Or walk away? And if you enjoy stories about property battles, HOA revenge, and people finally standing up to corruption, subscribe and stick around. There are a lot more mountains out there.